Good morning. Welcome again to Morning Devotions, and thank you so much for our time together. I want to talk to you today about a difficult subject, the sacredness of God's house. Now, I know we live in a modern church era in which most churches don't even see the need to build an altar for God in the earth, but there is a definite biblical need to build a place to take the tithe and the offerings of God's people and use them to do something permanent for God in this world, and not just consume everything on a pastor or a church's lifestyle. Now, brothers and sisters, when we build a house of God, we need to recognize that's different than any other place. We need to recognize that places that belong to God are different than any other place. We showed you that already in 2 Kings 17, verses 25 to 28. Even the land, a place where God lived, had to be considered different, and other people who came into the land said, hey, we need to find out what the God of this land requires. 2 Kings 19:34, 2 Kings 21, verses 4 to 9. All of these bring us up to a beautiful story of a young man by the name of King Joash, who cleansed the house of God. Now, I don't know where all of the sin in God's house started in biblical times. We know it started with the building of the high places under Solomon. It never occurred under David. Solomon built one altar for God and 700 demon altars on the hills and the high country surrounding Jerusalem for all of his foreign wives, one for each of their demon gods. But by the time we get to Manasseh, the king just before Joash, we find a horrible thing has happened. And now Joash comes in and he begins to rebuild the house of God, and they discover the law. And he begins to read the Word of God, and he begins to understand the sacredness of the life that God has called them to, and the sacredness of God's house. And we get over to chapter 23 in our text today, and we find that he cleanses it. Now, some of this stuff just amazes me. He takes the Asherah poles. I mean, this is like a male sexual organ at full erection that has been carved out and put into the temple courts. We find altars to the starry hosts that have been erected in the temple of God. We find male prostitutes, both homosexual and heterosexual, scholars tell us, that were there servicing people. I mean, they were actually having sex in the temple of God. We find all kinds of altars built all over the place inside God's temple. Now, brothers and sisters, you have to understand, from the very beginning, Satan said, I will exalt myself above the Most High God. I will sit enthroned on God's throne. Now, this is Satan's desire, to take God's place. Satan always wants to bring his sin into God's house. Now, brothers and sisters, I know it's as people would say, old school thinking, but forgive me, maybe you haven't been to the school of the Word yet. But you and I need to understand that God's house is not to be used for secular concerts. We're not to have secular singers standing up there singing and dancing and kissing and gyrating their bodies on Saturday night and then have church in the same place on Sunday morning. Not in God's house. We're not supposed to be using God's house for secular entertainment. We're not supposed to be bringing the world into God's house. We need to keep a sense of the sacred. That God's house is God's house. People come to God's house to be with God.